Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we're finishing with the video from World Video Bible School that attempts to explain why belief in God is rational. So far, we've got the fact that there are stories about people who believe for rational reasons, so we should also believe even though we don't get the same level of evidence as the people in the stories. The stories should be enough for us. Let's see if it gets any better.
Sadly, his enemies repeatedly rejected the irrefutable evidence that Jesus presented on his behalf.
Which, sure, given the events in the story, if the story were true, that would make them out to be rather foolish. So can you provide me with any evidence that would be equivalent to the evidence ignored by Jesus' enemies?
Perhaps the greatest evidence that Jesus presented for his divinity was his miraculous resurrection.
Which might have been good evidence for the people that saw him die and met him after his death. Unfortunately for us, all that we have for that is hearsay. And as much as Gary Habermas likes to suggest that he has lots of pages written about it,
just a little under 5,000 pages right now. So this is 100 pages of PhD notes on the resurrection. With the little formatting changing the pages, I'm probably give or take right about exactly 5,000 pages. 5,000 pages, 1,500 pages. 750 pages.
What it really comes down to is testimony from people who either were not witnesses to the event or never claimed to be witnesses to an actual bodily resurrection, but rather stating that they had a vision of the risen Christ. We have better evidence that the Roman Emperor Vespasian healed a blind man and a man with a damaged hand. Tacitus records eyewitness accounts of the event just 20 years after Vespasian's death, and the event is confirmed by Suetonius, along with an account of an ancient artifact being found that depicted Vespasian long before he was born. So that's multiple sources, closer to the death of the main subject than the books of the New Testament, and written in the genre of history, no less. The only books of the Bible that actually describe the events of the resurrection are Matthew, Luke, and John, with Mark originally ending at the empty tomb with no resurrection appearances, but having a resurrection added on about a century later. The earliest possible date for any writing on an actual bodily resurrection of Jesus is 85 CE, some 50 years after Jesus' death, from the books of Matthew and Luke. John is at least 70 years after the fact. In Acts, it does mention that Jesus appeared to 500 witnesses, but it does not say that he was bodily resurrected there, so it might have just been a vision. But let's just take it at its word. The accounts of Vespasian's miracles also record a great number of witnesses. On top of that, it's likely that at least one of Jesus' healing miracles were based on Vespasian's. Vespasian heals the blind man by spitting in his eyes, much like Jesus did with the blind man of Bethsaida. And since the Vespasian story can be traced to the Flavian propaganda campaign that accompanied his ascension as emperor, we know it came before the Jesus story. At the end of the day, there is better evidence that Vespasian was a divine godlike figure with healing powers and fulfilled prophecy than there is that Jesus actually came back from the dead. So why should I accept the Jesus resurrection story but not the Vespasian healing stories?
He could have risen from the dead and never appeared to anyone on earth.
Or he could have just not risen from the dead at all. That seems most likely to me, given the tendency for dead people to stay dead.
He could have departed from the tomb and allowed speculation to run wild.
Or he could have been thrown in a mass grave as was usual at the time for crucifixion victims, and since his body was never recovered, speculation ran wild for decades before anyone wrote it down.
Christianity could have begun on the back of uncertainty and mysticism.
You're right, it could have. In fact, it seems that it did. So add that to the list of reasons not to believe.
Instead, Jesus was declared to be the Son of God by the resurrection from the dead.
Yeah, that certainly is what Paul wrote, the guy who never actually said anything about Jesus being bodily resurrected, describing his experience with him as a vision. So a guy that never met Jesus when he was alive and never claimed to have seen him come back from the dead in bodily form, said that he was resurrected. The reliability here seems rather dubious.
He appeared alive to Mary Magdalene, to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, to the apostles, to James, and to over 500 disciples at once, most of whom were still living and could be questioned several years later when Paul, who also witnessed the risen Savior, wrote 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, sure. Just like large crowds of people were still testifying to the miracles of Vespasian, even when there could no longer be any gain from lying about it.
Jesus presented himself alive after his suffering by many infallible proofs.
Yes, according to the book of Acts, which was likely authored by the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke. So Acts and Luke together are one source, and we know that Luke and Matthew were working from the same source, so they are also one source. John was likely working from the same oral tradition that led to Matthew and Luke, but even if we pretend that Matthew and Luke are in agreement with the events, John is completely irreconcilable when you examine the details, and the only other source that talks about the resurrection is Paul, who never mentions it as anything more than a vision. So when you boil away the superfluous details, we have three sources, Matthew and Luke being one, Paul being another, and John being the third. Two of them are in conflict with each other, with the third being so vague as to be useless. And even if I take this verse at its word, that means that he gave other people infallible proofs, meaning he has not given me infallible proofs. He has just given me a second or third-hand account, depending on how you look at it, of supposed infallible proofs. And it's worth noting that the proofs described as infallible are nothing that any modern magician wouldn't be able to accomplish, like a sudden disappearing act after being eventually recognized by the people who failed to recognize him while traveling and talking with him all day. Oh yeah, and did I mention that even the account of the proof doesn't really seem all that infallible to me? I'm supposed to believe that the people who knew Jesus well could spend an entire day talking with the guy but not recognizing him until dinner time? And that's the infallible proof? That sounds more like some guy pulled a disappearing act to get out of paying for dinner, and when talking about it afterwards, they agreed that, yeah, he did look like Jesus. Maybe it was him.
Because he is the head of a reasonable religion.
At this point, it's just as reasonable as believing that Vespasian was the literal son of a god.
The excitement, energy, and courage that early disciples manifested was grounded in the rock-solid proofs of Jesus' resurrection, among other things.
Notice the lack of a supporting Bible verse for that claim. Quite telling that we don't actually find out what happened to the disciples until a couple hundred years after the fact. Even more telling that the accounts of their bravery and martyrdom weren't considered reliable enough to actually, make it into the Bible.
The emotional, energetic, evangelistic faith of 21st century Christians must likewise be rooted firm and deep in evidence.
Agreed. Now, care to provide any? So far, we don't have anything that wouldn't also get us to believing in all sorts of other miraculous events recorded by the classical historians.
But Jesus was not the only New Testament figure who demonstrated the necessity of a knowledge-based faith. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John packed their gospel accounts with confirmation of Jesus being the Christ.
Well, yeah, why wouldn't they? They were writing about a figure that they wanted people to believe was the Jewish Messiah, so they included details in their story to make the Jesus character fit with the expectations that they had for the Jewish Messiah.
Matthew began his account of the gospel by genealogically proving that Jesus was the Old Testament promised seed of Abraham and David.
And his genealogy does not match up with the genealogy found in Luke. The common apologetic for this one is that one is Mary's genealogy and the other is Joseph's, but the fact of the matter is that both genealogies explicitly state that they are Joseph's genealogies, and they don't even come close to matching, being significantly different in lengths and only having two names in common between King David and Joseph.
He then noted how Jesus was born of a virgin, fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah 7:14.
That prophecy was definitely not about Jesus, even if we ignore the fact that the word translated as virgin here actually means young woman. It's speaking of Assyria being brought against Judah and basically destroying the land. Isaiah 7:15 states that he shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse evil and choose the good. If Jesus is God, and this passage is about Jesus, then that means there was a time when God didn't know how to refuse evil and choose good. If you read the whole thing in context, it doesn't actually look like the child itself has anything to do with the fulfilling of the prophecy, other than to say the prophecy will be fulfilled before the kid reaches a certain age. It also says that his name will be Emmanuel, and the only time Jesus is ever referred to by that name is immediately after this one out-of-context verse is quoted. Nowhere else in the Bible does it call Jesus Emmanuel, so can we really say that that was his name if nobody ever used it to refer to him? So that one fails.
Mark began his gospel account by quoting Malachi 3:1 and Isaiah 43. Mark proved from the Old Testament prophecy that John the Baptizer was the voice of the one crying in the wilderness, and Jesus was the Lord.
Mark actually mashes Malachi 3:1 and Isaiah 43 together while claiming to only be quoting Isaiah. And these are the two that probably fit Jesus the best out of all the supposed prophecies that point to him. And they are incredibly vague, giving no details other than someone prepares the way. It's not very convincing.
Luke also opened his account of the good news with an appeal to evidence, knowledge, and understanding.
Yeah. Luke 1:1-4 is the author flat out stating that they are compiling a second-hand account at best. And then the author goes on to copy word for word a good chunk of the already written Gospel of Mark, which itself is not an eyewitness account, making Luke's version a third-hand account for the most part.
Then there is John's Gospel account, which from beginning to end is packed with proof that Jesus is the miracle-working Son of God.
Yes, the Gospel that was written the latest has the most miraculous content, almost like it was a legend that was growing over time. There are also places where John directly and purposefully contradicts the other Gospels because he wanted to paint a different picture of Jesus. For instance, the Synoptic Gospels all agree that Simon of Cyrene carried Jesus' cross, but in John, Jesus isn't some weakling who needs help with things. He carried his own damn cross, thank you very much. There are a number of problems with this, so it bears mentioning that the cross-carrying was part of the punishment. The Romans would not have inflicted part of the punishment on a random passerby in the crowd. So the Synoptic Gospels have reason to mention Simon carrying the cross. That would have been a remarkable event. But John had no reason to point out that Jesus carried his own cross, because that was a standard part of the punishment. Of course he carried his own cross. But he mentioned it, apparently to specifically counter the claim that Simon carried it for him. Had he remained silent on the subject of who carried the cross, the implication would be that Jesus carried it himself, unless there was already a tradition of Simon having carried it for him. So John went out of his way to mention that there wasn't anyone helping Jesus with it.
In fact, the stated purpose of his record of the various miracles of Christ was so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name.
Yes, the stated purpose of the book is not to convey historical data and facts, it is to be convincing to you. People are known to bend the truth when trying to convince others of their position, and John was written at least 70 years after the events it describes, so that's 70 years of oral truth-bending for the purpose of convincing, adding up to the most miraculous of the four Gospels. Notice that at no point do I say that anyone was lying. Often when trying to convince people in the process of bending the truth, you come to believe the bent version yourself. So it is entirely possible that every person in the chain of oral stories sincerely believed what they were saying, but after 70 years of getting passed around, the story would definitely have grown.
If biblical faith is merely a firm belief in something for which there is no proof, which is one definition Merriam-Webster has given for the word faith, then why did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John spend so much time offering proof for who Jesus is?
They really didn't, though. They were repeating stories with occasional scriptural references thrown in. Telling a story is not proof that the story is true.
Because the truthful, reasonable facts of God, His Word, and His Son are the foundation of real faith.
That's a bit of a jump there, going from the gospel authors were convinced that they had proof to we should accept the gospel claims themselves as the proof. Even if every word in the gospel were the truth, I do not have the same evidence that the authors of the gospels had. I only have their word that there was evidence. The appropriate position here is skepticism, not just believing it because the Bible says it. Now, I'm skipping ahead a bit. There is one more point I want to address, but he takes a long time to make it. When we come back in, he's talking about when Paul was in front of King Festus, and after telling him about his vision of Jesus, Festus proclaims that he's out of his mind.
How did Paul respond? Did he answer with a mere emotional appeal? Did he welcome the idea of an unreasonable, unverifiable gospel? Not at all. Paul humbly but confidently replied, I am not mad, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth and reason.
Well, there you have it. The guy who appears to be out of his mind confidently said, I'm not crazy! He doesn't give any evidence, he just asserts it. Because we all know that the best way to demonstrate your sanity is to say, I'm not insane, rather than providing any actual evidence of the claims that have resulted in your being accused of being insane.
Make no mistake about it. God has always been concerned with providing humanity with solid evidence which leads to a rock-solid, rational faith in Him and His Word.
His followers just won't tell us what any of that solid evidence is. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Unclean Unicorn, who says, "Leprechauns exist because the color green exists, and leprechauns are defined as the source of greenness. Denying leprechauns means you deny reality." Well, I deny that green exists. All that exists is photons with a wavelength that our brain interprets as green, but that interpretation is entirely illusory. So, ha! Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, David Schinkel, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the witnesses to the miracle that is my channel. If you'd like to prove that I am a deity, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!